Hello and welcome. If you enjoy deeply immersive history stories, be sure to subscribe and follow for more long narratives that explore the hidden corners of our past. Today, we are going to travel over 2,000 years back in time to an extraordinary and little-known episode in ancient history, a story that involves courage, miscalculation, and a deadly turn of fate. This is the story of why soldiers drank poisoned water during the Battle of the Himera River, a tale that is as human as it is tragic, and as strategic as it is fatal. Sicily, at this time, was a land of tremendous beauty and extraordinary strategic importance. Its fertile plains and abundant rivers, olive groves and wheat fields made it a prize for any power seeking to establish dominance over the Mediterranean. The island had long been a place where cultures collided, and by this period, it was divided among several Greek city-states, each with its own ambitions, leaders, and armies. These cities were descendants of settlers from the Greek mainland, carrying with them the traditions, the gods, and the rivalries of their original homes. Among the most prominent of these cities were Syracuse, a city whose influence extended across much of eastern Sicily, and the neighboring Carthaginian settlements along the western coast, powerful outposts of the great African maritime empire that had long sought to control trade and influence across the Mediterranean. Tensions between the Greek settlers and the Carthaginian forces were nothing new. Trade disputes, territorial skirmishes, and the constant struggle for dominance over key ports and fertile land created an environment where war seemed almost inevitable. It was in this crucible of political maneuvering, ambition, and the desire for security that the events leading to the Battle of the Himera River unfolded. The Greeks were determined to defend their lands, to protect their people and preserve their cities from the encroaching influence of Carthage, whose soldiers and mercenaries were renowned for their discipline, strategy, and ruthlessness in battle. The commander of the Greek forces, Agathocles, was a man of formidable intelligence and unyielding ambition. Known for his tactical brilliance and occasionally ruthless strategies, he had built a reputation as a leader who could turn seemingly hopeless situations into victories. Yet even the most brilliant commanders are subject to the unpredictable chaos of war, and the events surrounding the Himera River would prove that even the best-laid plans could unravel in the face of unforeseen consequences. On the morning of the battle, the Greek army, composed of citizen soldiers, mercenaries, and allied troops, prepared for engagement with the Carthaginian forces. The sun rose over the fertile Sicilian plains, casting long shadows across the landscape and glinting off the bronze armor and shields of the soldiers. Horses pawed at the ground, banners fluttered in the gentle breeze, and the smell of freshly baked bread mingled with the earthy aroma of the river nearby. For many of the soldiers, this would be the day that tested their courage, endurance, and loyalty in ways they could never have anticipated. The battlefield was chosen with a careful eye. The Himera River, a slow-flowing but substantial waterway, cut across the plain and provided both a natural obstacle and a potential resource. The Greek commanders positioned their troops strategically, knowing that the Carthaginians were skilled at both frontal assaults and flanking maneuvers. Every soldier understood his role, from the hoplites in the front lines, heavily armored and trained to hold the enemy at bay, to the light infantry tasked with skirmishing and harassing the opposing forces. Even the archers and slingers, positioned along small rises and natural embankments, knew that their arrows and stones would play a critical role in shaping the outcome of the battle. As the battle commenced, the sound of war filled the air. Shields clashed against swords, spears pierced armor, and the cries of men and animals created a cacophony that would have been both terrifying and exhilarating to witness. The Greek soldiers fought with courage and determination, holding their lines against the disciplined advance of the Carthaginian forces. Hours passed, and the fighting intensified, with both sides taking heavy losses. The sun climbed higher, and exhaustion began to set in, as men struggled not only against their enemies, but also against the relentless fatigue of battle under the scorching Sicilian sun. In the midst of this chaos, a critical yet overlooked factor began to influence the fate of the soldiers. The river, which had seemed a simple source of refreshment, had become tainted. Whether through contamination from upstream or the presence of naturally occurring toxic minerals, the water was dangerous to drink. But the soldiers, driven by thirst, heat, and the urgency of their labor and struggle, had little choice but to approach the river. For many, the momentary relief of quenching their thirst turned into a fatal miscalculation. As they drank, the subtle but potent effects of the poisoned water began to manifest. Some experienced nausea, dizziness, and weakness, while others collapsed outright, their muscles failing under the sudden assault of the toxins. The tragedy of this incident was compounded by the confusion and intensity of the ongoing battle. Commanders could scarcely intervene, and soldiers who had survived the initial clash found themselves debilitated by the very resource they had relied upon for survival. The battle continued around them, yet the tide had begun to shift not solely through the strategic brilliance or errors of commanders, but through a hidden and invisible hazard that no army could predict with certainty. As the hours passed, the consequences became ever more apparent. Soldiers who might have rallied and held the line fell one by one. Skirmishes that had been tightly contested now saw units breaking and scattering, not because of enemy prowess alone, but because of the insidious effects of the poisoned river water. Leaders moved among their men, shouting commands and attempting to rally those who were faltering. Yet there was only so much they could do against the physical debilitation that struck so suddenly and indiscriminately. The human struggle became raw and visible, men gripping their arms, pressing their hands to their stomachs, collapsing under the weight of exhaustion and toxin alike, faces contorted in pain, eyes wide with disbelief, yet still clinging to life and hope as best they could. In the aftermath, the true scale of the tragedy became evident. Entire units had been rendered ineffective not by swords or spears, but by the poisoned water they had so desperately sought to sustain themselves. Survivors would later recount the chaos, the fear, and the disorientation that had accompanied drinking from the river, emphasizing how a simple act, taken under duress and instinctive survival, had altered the course of the battle in ways no one could have foreseen. The story of the Himera River would become a lesson in the unpredictable nature of warfare, illustrating how even the most carefully planned campaigns could be undone by the smallest and most overlooked details. The psychological toll on the soldiers was profound. Many would carry the memory of that poisoned water and its effects long after the battle had ended. Comrades who had stood shoulder to shoulder fell in moments, their lives snatched away not by the enemy's hand, but by an environmental hazard that neither they nor their commanders had anticipated. The experience underscored the fragile balance between preparation and chance, between human ingenuity and the unpredictable forces of nature, and between courage and vulnerability in the theater of war. The city-states of Sicily would remember the battle for generations, not merely for the clash of arms, but for the tragic lesson of the poisoned river. The Himera River became more than a geographical feature. It became a symbol of the unseen dangers that lie in wait even in times of perceived strength and confidence. And for those who survived, the story of why soldiers drank poisoned water during that fateful engagement would be told as a warning, a cautionary tale about the limits of human control over events, the role of chance in history, and the ever-present intersection of bravery and vulnerability in the lives of men and women caught in the sweep of larger conflicts. The narrative surrounding this battle extends beyond the immediate human cost. It speaks to the larger geopolitical tensions of the time, the ambitions of empires and city-states, and the fragile alliances that define the Greek world. The Greeks, Carthaginians, and other Mediterranean powers were locked in a delicate dance of war, diplomacy, and trade, each seeking advantage while balancing the constant threat of unforeseen disaster. A single river, one small source of water, could alter the outcome of a campaign, demonstrating that history is not only shaped by kings, generals, and armies, but also by the natural world and the hazards it presents. Even the physical geography of Sicily played a role. The river itself, while providing sustenance and a natural boundary, carried within it the hidden potential for calamity. Soldiers marching long distances under the hot sun, wearing heavy armor, and engaging in strenuous combat relied on water for survival, yet that very water could betray them. The combination of human exertion, environmental conditions, and unrecognized hazards created a perfect storm, a moment where the unpredictable and uncontrollable forces of nature intersected tragically with human ambition and effort. The lesson of the Himera River is one that resonates through history. It reminds us that no matter the skill of a commander, the courage of soldiers, or the strategic brilliance of a plan, there are always variables beyond human control. The poisoned water is a metaphor for the unseen dangers in every historical moment, the forces that act invisibly yet powerfully to shape outcomes, and the delicate balance between survival and disaster that is ever present in the human story. And yet, amidst the tragedy, there is also a testament to resilience. Soldiers who survived the poisoned water, who endured despite physical collapse and confusion, displayed remarkable courage and determination. Their actions under duress, the way they adapted, fell back, or regrouped, reveal a human spirit capable of facing extreme adversity while continuing to strive, fight, and live. The ripple effects of the battle extended beyond the immediate casualties. The Greek city-states involved would need to reassess their strategies, reconsider their alliances, and understand that victory in war requires attention not only to tactics and bravery, but also to the often overlooked details of logistics, environment, and survival. The poisoned river, a seemingly minor feature of the battlefield, became a defining element of the campaign, illustrating that history is often determined as much by chance and circumstance as by skill and planning. The surviving soldiers, weakened by the poisoned river water, struggled to regain formation as the Carthaginian forces pressed forward. The clash of bronze and iron reverberated across the plain, but each step felt heavier for those whose muscles had begun to fail from the toxic water. Some stumbled, clutching at their stomachs, trying to maintain balance on uneven ground, while comrades reached out to steady them, dragging them from danger and urging them to push on. Dust and blood mixed underfoot, coating armor and tunics, and the heat of the day added to the sense of suffocating exhaustion. Every movement required an almost superhuman effort, and yet retreat was not an option, not if they were to protect the settlements behind them or preserve what remained of their lines. Commanders shouted, waving their arms and pointing toward strategic positions, but their voices were often lost in the roar of battle. Messengers dashed back and forth, carrying urgent orders that sometimes went unheeded as soldiers were consumed by sudden waves of nausea and dizziness. In many cases, entire squads collapsed almost simultaneously, as though the river itself had reached into the ranks and robbed men of their strength. The Carthaginians noticed these weaknesses and sought to exploit them, pressing their attack at points where the Greeks' cohesion faltered. Arrows arced through the sky, glinting in the sunlight before striking shields and armor, and the sound of metal striking metal punctuated the cries of men in pain. Amid the chaos, Agathocles moved deliberately along the front lines, scanning the battlefield for opportunities and threats alike. He observed the effects of the poisoned water on his soldiers, realizing that the challenge before him was no longer solely a tactical one, but a matter of human endurance and survival. He called upon the reserves, those who had been held back in anticipation of critical moments, and directed them toward weakened sectors, attempting to stabilize the faltering lines. The interplay of strategy and improvisation became the defining element of the battle, as no plan could fully account for the invisible hazard that had suddenly decimated portions of the army. The soldiers themselves fought with a grim determination that could only come from desperation. They pressed forward despite the burning in their stomachs, the trembling of their limbs, and the haze of dizziness that clouded their vision. Their minds were filled with fragmented thoughts, images of home, fleeting memories of loved ones, the hope of survival, and the sheer instinct to endure. Even those who were not yet affected by the poisoned water carried the burden of seeing comrades collapse, their own morale tempered by fear, responsibility, and the pressing need to maintain cohesion. Some found temporary relief at smaller, uncontaminated streams or pools, but these were scarce and often surrounded by open ground that exposed them to enemy fire. Soldiers risked arrows and spears for a moment of water, their thirst and physical needs competing against the immediate threat of death from combat. Others attempted to ration themselves, taking only tiny sips and moving on, but the strain of prolonged exertion under the Sicilian sun made even this strategy insufficient. The subtle but persistent effects of the poison continued to sap strength, turning minor injuries into debilitating obstacles and small wounds into sources of growing weakness. As the battle progressed, the Carthaginian commanders observed the unusual attrition among their Greek adversaries and adjusted their tactics. They concentrated attacks on areas showing the greatest signs of faltering, sending their best troops to probe the weakened points. Yet even they were not immune to the challenges of the battlefield. The heat, the dust, the clashing of men, and the ever-present unpredictability of soldiers. Reactions created a dynamic and chaotic environment where no outcome was guaranteed. Every decision, from the deployment of reserves to the selection of targets, carried with it the potential to succeed or fail in dramatic and unforeseen ways. Meanwhile, the Greek soldiers who had survived the initial poisoning were learning to cope with the sensation of weakness, sometimes leaning on comrades for support, sometimes pressing onward through sheer force of will. Each advance required careful calculation: how to move without exhausting limited energy, how to maintain defensive positions without succumbing to dizziness, how to strike effectively while fighting the body's betrayal from the poisoned water. The physical and mental fatigue intertwined, creating a battlefield where endurance, focus, and adaptability became as decisive as swords, spears, or armor. The flow of the Himera River itself became a silent, menacing presence. What had once been a source of refreshment in life now acted as a boundary between survival and further suffering. Soldiers avoided returning to its waters, even as their thirst grew, and the sight of those who had succumbed to its poison haunted the battlefield. Bodies were carried to the edges of the plain, and small rituals of respect, however brief, were performed even in the heat of combat. Some attempted to warn comrades of the danger, shouting to avoid the river, but the noise and intensity of the clash rendered many such warnings ineffective. By midday, the intensity of the engagement had begun to take its toll on both sides. Carthaginian forces, despite their strategic advantage, were increasingly wary of overextending themselves, as they too faced exhaustion, heat, and the chaos of the battlefield. The Greek lines, while weakened by poison and fatigue, still demonstrated pockets of stubborn resistance. These moments of resilience allowed commanders to attempt countermeasures, repositioning troops and reinforcing critical areas. The ebb and flow of battle became a complex dance of human strength, strategic foresight, and the ever-present unpredictability of circumstance. Amid the chaos, some individual acts of heroism stood out. Soldiers who might otherwise have succumbed to weakness pushed themselves beyond normal limits to rescue comrades, hold key positions, or strike critical blows against the enemy. Their determination, driven by loyalty, survival instinct, and the immediate pressures of battle, exemplified the human capacity to endure extreme conditions. The poisoned water that had debilitated so many had, in some cases, also catalyzed extraordinary efforts of endurance, highlighting the paradoxical interplay of tragedy and heroism in the unfolding narrative. The psychological dimension of the battle was as significant as the physical. Soldiers confronted not only the threat of enemy attack, but also the stark realization that even basic necessities, such as water, could betray them. Fear, Anxiety and confusion interwove with courage, determination, and tactical awareness. Commanders had to consider not only positioning and maneuvers, but also the fragile morale of men whose bodies were failing them in ways that were impossible to fully anticipate or control. The uncertainty of who would collapse next, who would be able to maintain strength, and how the enemy might exploit these weaknesses created an ever-shifting mental landscape that shaped decisions on every level. As afternoon approached, the cumulative effects of fatigue, battle injuries, and poisoned water became increasingly visible. Soldiers staggered, leaning on shields or each other for support, while some collapsed outright, unable to continue. The sound of combat continued, but interspersed with groans of pain, calls for assistance, and the occasional scream. The battlefield, already chaotic, assumed a near-surreal quality as exhaustion and the subtle poison combined, blurring the line between conscious effort and involuntary collapse. Despite these overwhelming challenges, the Greek forces continued to resist. Small groups maintained defensive positions, counterattacking where possible, and adapting to the changing conditions with remarkable ingenuity. Commanders coordinated movements as best they could, using signals, messengers, and visual cues to compensate for the reduced physical capacity of their men. Every decision was infused with the awareness that the smallest misstep could result in further collapse, and yet every choice also offered the possibility of survival and strategic advantage. The Carthaginians, observing the shifting dynamics, adjusted their strategies as well. They focused attacks on the most vulnerable sectors, carefully calculating the risk of pressing too hard against an exhausted but still capable enemy. Each maneuver carried a heightened tension, as the effects of the poisoned water created unpredictability that could not be fully anticipated. Success required not only skill and planning, but also adaptability to the chaotic and ever-changing conditions imposed by the combination of human exertion, environmental factors, and misfortune. Even as the day wore on, the river remained a central presence, a silent observer of the unfolding human struggle. Soldiers avoided its waters, wary of the hidden danger, and its banks became littered with those who had succumbed to both poison and fatigue. The river, which should have symbolized life and sustenance, had become an agent of misfortune, shaping the battle in ways neither side could have predicted. The scene was one of extraordinary tension, where every movement, every sip of water, and every act of courage or desperation could shift the course of events in profound and irreversible ways. The men on the battlefield adapted as best they could. Some formed small units to move carefully across the plain, balancing the need for mobility with the reality of limited strength. Others focused on defensive positions, using terrain features such as small rises, ditches, or natural embankments to conserve energy while still engaging the enemy. Leaders encouraged the soldiers, reminded them of their duty, and attempted to maintain cohesion in the face of unprecedented difficulty. The interplay of human ingenuity, resilience, and sheer survival instinct became the defining factor of the afternoon. The Greek soldiers who had managed to remain upright began to develop an almost mechanical rhythm, moving in coordinated steps that belied the inner chaos of their bodies. Each man knew that a single misstep could spell disaster, whether from the poisoned water weakening his limbs or from the enemy exploiting any lapse in attention. Some gritted their teeth and pressed onward, ignoring the burning nausea and trembling in their arms, while others relied on the support of comrades, linking arms or gripping shields to maintain balance and cohesion. The battlefield had become a study in human endurance, a test not merely of martial skill, but of sheer willpower and the capacity to continue functioning under conditions of relentless physical deterioration. Commanders on both sides began to recognize that the usual markers of battle success, unit formations, flanking maneuvers, and sheer numbers, were being compromised by a factor entirely outside their control. The Carthaginians, who had counted on predictable Greek resistance, noticed the staggered movements, the faltering lines, and the uncharacteristic pauses. Some assumed initially that fatigue from combat alone accounted for the weakness, but it soon became evident that there was something more insidious at play. Even their best scouts and messengers could not provide clarity, as the effects of the poisoned river water remained invisible until experienced firsthand by the soldiers. The heat of the Sicilian sun compounded the effects of the river. Armor that had once offered protection now became a burden, trapping heat and causing further dehydration. Helmets pressed down uncomfortably on sweaty heads, and linen tunics clung to bodies slick with moisture. The air, heavy with dust and the smell of disturbed earth, added to the sense of oppressive exertion. Soldiers adjusted their movements to compensate, sometimes staggering forward with one hand pressing against a helmet or shield, other times dropping to a crouch to take advantage of gravity while maintaining some semblance of mobility. Every action required careful calculation, as even minor miscalculations could lead to collapse or injury. Meanwhile, the river itself remained a silent threat on the flanks of the battlefield. Soldiers who approached its edge sought relief, hoping that a sip of water might rejuvenate them, yet even cautious attempts carried enormous risk. Some who drank from less contaminated tributaries found only temporary relief, as the toxin lingered in the system and slowly weakened them over time. Others misjudged the flow or depth of the river, stepping into mud or slippery banks and falling in ways that left them exposed to enemy attack. The river, once an innocent feature of the terrain, had become a formidable adversary in its own right, shaping the ebb and flow of the battle through the subtle power of its hidden danger. Amid the chaos, small acts of extraordinary bravery emerged. Soldiers who might have been expected to falter instead pressed forward to carry wounded comrades, retrieve fallen weapons, or secure critical positions. Some leapt across treacherous ground to deliver messages or supplies, knowing that delay could doom entire units. Others, despite the effects of the poisoned water, held positions against overwhelming odds, striking decisively and retreating only when absolutely necessary. The human capacity for adaptation and resilience was on full display, as the soldiers discovered ways to endure, improvise, and exploit whatever resources remained at their disposal. The Carthaginian commanders also adjusted their tactics in response to the unusual conditions. Observing the faltering Greek lines, they concentrated their efforts on the most vulnerable sections, sending elite troops to break through and exploit gaps. Yet even they faced difficulties, as overextending into weak but still active units risked ambush or counterattack. The battlefield became a dynamic, constantly shifting environment in which the outcomes of maneuvers could not be predicted with certainty. Each decision carried weighty consequences, and the interplay between strategy, human endurance, and environmental factors created a level of complexity rarely encountered in historical accounts. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the intensity of the engagement remained high. Soldiers moved with a combination of precision and improvisation, guided by training but constrained by exhaustion. Injured men were carried off the field when possible, and those still capable of fighting pressed forward with grim determination. The poisoned water continued to exert its influence, weakening muscles, clouding judgment, and draining energy. Commanders constantly recalculated their plans, redirecting units, reinforcing vulnerable positions, and attempting to predict the enemy's movements in a landscape transformed by exhaustion and chemical assault. In one particularly tense moment, a Greek unit holding a narrow pass along the riverbank found itself surrounded on 3 sides. The soldiers had little choice but to defend the position, though many were weakened by the poisoned water and had already been forced to abandon heavier equipment. Shields were lowered and spears thrust with trembling arms, each movement exacting a visible toll on the men. Despite the apparent hopelessness, the unit managed to hold for a critical period, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. Their faces, marked by sweat, dirt, and the strain of continued exertion, reflected a combination of fear, concentration, and unwavering resolve. Elsewhere on the battlefield, a young soldier, barely more than a boy, carried a message from the center of the Greek lines to a flank threatened by Carthaginian forces. Each step was labored, his legs trembling from exertion, yet he pressed forward, dodging enemy strikes and avoiding the slippery riverbank. His tunic, soaked with sweat and mud, clung to his body as he clutched the parchment tightly. He became a living example of the interaction between human courage and the insidious effects of environmental hazards, demonstrating how even minor actors could influence the outcome of a battle when the stakes were high and the terrain was treacherous. The river, winding through the battlefield like a quiet serpent, continued to claim its toll. Some soldiers attempting to cross or approach its waters collapsed without warning, their faces contorted in pain and confusion. Commanders shouted warnings and attempted to divert men to safer water sources, but the combined effect of urgency, heat, and the addictive relief of cool water made complete avoidance nearly impossible. Bodies littered the banks, some carried by comrades, others left behind in the chaos, creating grim reminders of the hidden peril that had infiltrated the heart of the battle. By late afternoon, the accumulated effects of the poisoned water were unmistakable. Units that had begun the day with cohesion now displayed uneven ranks, staggered movements, and gaps exploited by Carthaginian forces. The battle had become as much about endurance and adaptability as it had been about martial skill. Soldiers who could maintain strength moved strategically, assisting others, covering retreats, and maintaining pressure where necessary. The dynamic of the battlefield had shifted from a contest of numerical superiority to a struggle of willpower, coordination, and survival under extreme conditions. Amid this environment, Agathocles made critical decisions that would influence the ultimate outcome. He recognized the need to compensate for the poisoned water's effect by redistributing forces, reinforcing weak points, and exploiting the remaining pockets of strength. His orders were precise, yet the execution depended on the physical capacity and determination of men already stretched to their limits. Each movement, whether advancing, retreating, or holding position, was a complex interplay of human capability, environmental challenge, and immediate tactical necessity. At the same time, soldiers improvised. Some used small tools or environmental features to stabilize themselves or assist comrades, while others adapted their fighting style, shortening their strikes or relying on shields and formations to conserve energy. The poisoned water had altered not only their physical capacity, but also the way they approached every action, forcing an evolution in strategy and technique in real time. These improvisations demonstrated the remarkable resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit, even under extreme duress. The exhaustion and slow poisoning did not merely reduce physical capability, it began to affect perception and coordination. Soldiers who had been trained to react instantly to orders found their timing delayed, reflexes dulled, and senses partially clouded. The once precise phalanx formations wavered as men staggered, shields sagging and spears tilting slightly off axis. Commanders had to compensate, shouting louder, signaling more frequently, and personally moving between groups to maintain a semblance of structure. Even small deviations in alignment had consequences, as Carthaginian soldiers quickly noticed openings and exploited them, pressing forward with disciplined precision. Amidst this chaos, individual initiative became invaluable. Some soldiers, noticing the stagger of a nearby unit, rushed to support them, using sheer strength to brace faltering comrades or carry weapons for those too weak to wield them. Others took advantage of the terrain, moving to slightly elevated ground to gain leverage, or using natural obstacles to create temporary protection from enemy attacks. The riverbank, once a clear boundary, had transformed into a treacherous no-man's land. Mud, loose rocks, and uneven banks combined with the weakened state of the soldiers to make every step a potential hazard. Some fell and had to be pulled out by those still standing, while others barely kept from tumbling into the water, the poisoned current lapping dangerously close to their feet. In several cases, soldiers had to make rapid, life-or-death decisions under the influence of both fatigue and poisoning. One group of hoplites found themselves cut off from reinforcements, trapped between the advancing Carthaginians and the river. Their options were limited: attempt to fight their way back to friendly lines, risk crossing the poisoned water, or hold their ground against an encroaching enemy. They chose to fight, their desperation sharpening their focus, even as their limbs trembled from the toxin and the relentless exertion of the morning's combat. Each strike of spear or sword was heavier, each movement requiring conscious effort to overcome weakness, yet they pressed on with grim determination. Nearby, archers who had maintained some distance from the front lines attempted to support these faltering units. Their arms, too, were affected by the heat and fatigue, arrows occasionally missing their mark or falling short, but they continued to fire, adjusting their technique, shifting their stance, and using clever angles to compensate. The coordination between long-range and close combat units became critical, each reliant not just on training, but on observation, communication, and improvisation, all while the insidious effects of the poisoned water continued to sap the strength of the soldiers. The psychological tension was palpable. Men glanced repeatedly at the river, knowing what lay in its waters, yet the thirst and physical exhaustion made it impossible to ignore the call of survival. Those who resisted the temptation to drink knew that every sip could be fatal, yet every step and exertion seemed to increase the need for hydration. Fear of the unseen enemy within the river compounded the immediate threat posed by the Carthaginians, creating an environment in which every decision carried enormous weight. Panic was restrained, yet constantly simmering, tempered by discipline, camaraderie, and the singular focus on survival and mission. Commanders moved among their troops with urgency. Agathocles, observing the effect of the poisoned water, understood that leadership now required more than tactical brilliance. It demanded empathy, improvisation, and the ability to inspire men to continue when their own bodies were betraying them. Orders were tailored, encouragement given, and small victories celebrated, not for strategic advantage, but for the psychological boost they provided. Soldiers responded to these signals with varying degrees of success, some finding renewed strength in the presence of their leader, others succumbing to weakness despite the rallying efforts. The Carthaginian commanders, astute observers of human behavior, began to notice patterns. Soldiers weakened by the poisoned water moved slower, reacted later, and displayed subtle changes in behavior that indicated both distress and diminished capacity for sustained combat. They adjusted their strategy, timing assaults to coincide with the moments when Greek units were most vulnerable, while also keeping reserves ready to exploit breakthroughs. Their disciplined observation and tactical adjustment demonstrated that even in situations dominated by environmental hazards, strategic acumen could still influence the outcome. Meanwhile, the soldiers themselves faced the stark reality of mortality. Each movement became an assessment of risk. How far could one step before collapse? How much energy could be spent raising a shield or thrusting a spear before limbs failed? How could one continue to fight without succumbing to nausea or dizziness? These considerations were not abstract. They were immediate, pressing, and vital. A single lapse could mean being cut down by an enemy soldier, slipping into the poisoned river, or being unable to defend a comrade. And yet, despite these risks, men continued to act with determination, guided by training, instinct, and the raw force of survival. The river, still flowing deceptively calmly alongside the battlefield, became a symbol of both temptation and treachery. Some soldiers, seeing the parched lips and burning throats of their comrades, briefly forgot caution and attempted to drink, only to be struck by the immediate effects of the toxin. Others approached, hands trembling, to wet their mouths or wash their faces, attempting to gain temporary relief. Yet these minor interactions with the water also came at a cost. The river's role in shaping the course of the battle grew ever more evident, as its subtle influence manifested not in the loud clamor of combat, but in the quiet collapse of individual soldiers whose strength ebbed away almost imperceptibly. By late afternoon, the battlefield had transformed into a patchwork of chaos and endurance. Units that had begun the day in close, disciplined formations were now stretched thin, with gaps appearing in lines, isolated soldiers navigating treacherous ground alone or in pairs, and commanders constantly shifting resources to compensate for losses. The combination of environmental hazard, extreme physical exertion, and unrelenting combat created conditions in which only adaptability and resilience could determine survival. Soldiers had to improvise at every turn, adjusting movements, altering tactics, and finding ways to continue functioning, even as their bodies protested violently against the strain. In one striking instance, a group of Greek soldiers reached a section of the river that was slightly less contaminated. Tentatively, they knelt to drink, but even this act carried enormous risk. Some felt immediate weakness, others a delayed response that left them vulnerable within minutes. Comrades had to support each other, pulling men from the edge, stabilizing those who were staggering, and maintaining defensive positions while the effects of the poisoned water rippled through their ranks. These moments highlighted the brutal interplay of human desperation, natural hazards, and the chaos of combat, emphasizing that even seemingly minor decisions could have life-or-death consequences. As the sun began to approach the horizon, casting long shadows across the Sicilian plain, the cumulative toll of the poisoned water, heat, fatigue, and sustained combat reached a peak. Soldiers who had managed to endure the morning and early afternoon now faced the compounded effects of exhaustion, reduced coordination, and the slow degradation of strength. Leaders worked frantically to coordinate movements, reposition units, and exploit any opportunity that remained, knowing that the final hours of the battle could be decisive. Yet each command was contingent upon human bodies and minds that had been compromised in ways both subtle and profound. The interplay of human ingenuity, endurance, and environmental hazard defined the final stages of engagement. Soldiers relied on instinct, training, and the support of comrades to navigate the battlefield, maintain defensive positions, and continue pressing attacks where possible. The poisoned river remained a silent but ever-present factor, influencing movement, morale, and survival. The chaos of combat, normally dictated by predictable tactics and strength of will, had become intertwined with an invisible hazard, producing outcomes that could not be fully foreseen and testing the limits of human capacity in every respect. The exhaustion and slow poisoning did not merely reduce physical capability. It began to affect perception and coordination. Soldiers who had been trained to react instantly to orders found their timing delayed, reflexes dulled, and senses partially clouded. The once precise phalanx formations wavered as men staggered, shields sagging and spears tilting slightly off-axis. Commanders had to compensate, shouting louder, signaling more frequently, and personally moving between groups to maintain a semblance of structure. Even small deviations in alignment had consequences, as Carthaginian soldiers quickly noticed openings and exploited them, pressing forward with disciplined precision. Amidst this chaos, individual initiative became invaluable. Some soldiers, noticing the stagger of a nearby unit, rushed to support them, using sheer strength to brace faltering comrades or carry weapons for those too weak to wield them. Others took advantage of the terrain, moving to slightly elevated ground to gain leverage or using natural obstacles to create temporary protection from enemy attacks. The riverbank, once a clear boundary, had transformed into a treacherous no-man's land. Mud, loose rocks, and uneven banks combined with the weakened state of the soldiers to make every step a potential hazard. Some fell and had to be pulled out by those still standing, while others barely kept from tumbling into the water, the poisoned current lapping dangerously close to their feet. In several cases, soldiers had to make rapid, life-or-death decisions under the influence of both fatigue and poisoning. One group of hoplites found themselves cut off from reinforcements, trapped between the advancing Carthaginians and the river. Their options were limited: attempt to fight their way back to friendly lines, risk crossing the poisoned water, or hold their ground against an encroaching enemy. They chose to fight, their desperation sharpening their focus, even as their limbs trembled from the toxin and the relentless exertion of the morning's combat. Each strike of spear or sword was heavier, each movement requiring conscious effort to overcome weakness, yet they pressed on with grim determination. Nearby, archers who had maintained some distance from the front lines attempted to support these faltering units. Their arms, too, were affected by the heat and fatigue, arrows occasionally missing their mark or falling short, but they continued to fire, adjusting their technique, shifting their stance, and using clever angles to compensate. The coordination between long-range and close combat units became critical, each reliant not just on training, but on observation, communication, and improvisation, all while the insidious effects of the poisoned water continued to sap the strength of the soldiers. The psychological tension was palpable. Men glanced repeatedly at the river, knowing what lay in its waters, yet the thirst and physical exhaustion made it impossible to ignore the call of survival. Those who resisted the temptation to drink knew that every sip could be fatal, yet every step and exertion seemed to increase the need for hydration. Fear of the unseen enemy within the river compounded the immediate threat posed by the Carthaginians, creating an environment in which every decision carried enormous weight. Panic was restrained, yet constantly simmering, tempered by discipline, camaraderie, and the singular focus on survival and mission. Commanders moved among their troops with urgency. Agathocles, observing the effect of the poisoned water, understood that leadership now required more than tactical brilliance. It demanded empathy, improvisation, and the ability to inspire men to continue when their own bodies were betraying them. Orders were tailored, encouragement given, and small victories celebrated, not for strategic advantage, but for the psychological boost they provided. Soldiers responded to these signals with varying degrees of success, some finding renewed strength in the presence of their leader, others succumbing to weakness despite the rallying efforts. The Carthaginian commanders, astute observers of human behavior, began to notice patterns. Soldiers weakened by the poisoned water moved slower, reacted later, and displayed subtle changes in behavior that indicated both distress and diminished capacity for sustained combat. They adjusted their strategy, timing assaults to coincide with the moments when Greek units were most vulnerable, while also keeping reserves ready to exploit breakthroughs. Their disciplined observation and tactical adjustment demonstrated that even in situations dominated by environmental hazards, strategic acumen could still influence the outcome. Meanwhile, the soldiers themselves faced the stark reality of mortality. Each movement became an assessment of risk. How far could one step before collapse? How much energy could be spent raising a shield or thrusting a spear before limbs failed? How could one continue to fight without succumbing to nausea or dizziness? These considerations were not abstract. They were immediate, pressing, and vital. A single lapse could mean being cut down by an enemy soldier, slipping into the poisoned river, or being unable to defend a comrade. And yet, despite these risks, men continued to act with determination, guided by training, instinct, and the raw force of survival. The river, still flowing deceptively calmly alongside the battlefield, became a symbol of both temptation and treachery. Some soldiers, seeing the parched lips and burning throats of their comrades, briefly forgot caution and attempted to drink, only to be struck by the immediate effects of the toxin. Others approached, hands trembling, to wet their mouths or wash their faces, attempting to gain temporary relief, Yet these minor interactions with the water also came at a cost. The river's role in shaping the course of the battle grew ever more evident, as its subtle influence manifested not in the loud clamor of combat, but in the quiet collapse of individual soldiers whose strength ebbed away almost imperceptibly. By late afternoon, the battlefield had transformed into a patchwork of chaos and endurance. Units that had begun the day in close, disciplined formations were now stretched thin, with gaps appearing in lines, isolated soldiers navigating treacherous ground alone or in pairs, and commanders constantly shifting resources to compensate for losses. The combination of environmental hazard, extreme physical exertion, and unrelenting combat created conditions in which only adaptability and resilience could determine survival. Soldiers had to improvise at every turn, adjusting movements, altering tactics, and finding ways to continue functioning, even as their bodies protested violently against the strain. In one striking instance, a group of Greek soldiers reached a section of the river that was slightly less contaminated. Tentatively, they knelt to drink, but even this act carried enormous risk. Some felt immediate weakness, others a delayed response that left them vulnerable within minutes. Comrades had to support each other, pulling men from the edge, stabilizing those who were staggering, and maintaining defensive positions while the effects of the poisoned water rippled through their ranks. These moments highlighted the brutal interplay of human desperation, natural hazards, and the chaos of combat, emphasizing that even seemingly minor decisions could have life-or-death consequences. As the sun began to approach the horizon, casting long shadows across the Sicilian plain, the cumulative toll of the poisoned water, heat, fatigue, and sustained combat reached a peak. Soldiers who had managed to endure the morning and early afternoon now faced the compounded effects of exhaustion, reduced coordination, and the slow degradation of strength. Leaders worked frantically to coordinate movements, reposition units, and exploit any opportunity that remained, knowing that the final hours of the battle could be decisive. Yet each command was contingent upon human bodies and minds that had been compromised in ways both subtle and profound. The interplay of human ingenuity, endurance, and environmental hazard defined the final stages of engagement. Soldiers relied on instinct, training, and the support of comrades to navigate the battlefield, maintain defensive positions, and continue pressing attacks where possible. The poisoned river remained a silent but ever-present factor, influencing movement, morale, and survival. The chaos of combat, normally dictated by predictable tactics and strength of will, had become intertwined with an invisible hazard, producing outcomes that could not be fully foreseen and testing the limits of human capacity in every respect. As evening approached, the light on the battlefield shifted, painting the dust, blood, and armor with a dull, reddish glow. The soldiers, now marked by hours of exertion, began to experience a disorienting combination of hunger, thirst, and pain. Their bodies were not only weakened by the poisoned river water, but also by the cumulative strain of exertion, minor injuries, and the relentless tension of combat. Some could no longer distinguish the sounds of distant battle from those nearby. Cries and clanging metal blended into a single, overwhelming roar. In the midst of this confusion, human perception became unreliable, and instinct often guided action more than conscious thought. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the terrain of Sicily began to assert itself in unexpected ways. The river, winding lazily through the plains, had flooded in small sections due to upstream rainfall days earlier, creating patches of deep mud and hidden bogs. Soldiers attempting to traverse these areas often found themselves trapped, their boots sinking into the muck, leaving them vulnerable to enemy attacks or forcing them to crawl forward to escape the sticky, treacherous ground. These natural obstacles compounded the effects of the poisoned water. Even the most physically capable men found their strength insufficient to overcome the dual challenges of toxin and terrain. In one sector of the battlefield, A contingent of Greek archers and slingers discovered that the river's poisoned waters could be used strategically. By luring small groups of advancing Carthaginian soldiers toward contaminated streams or puddles, they could temporarily incapacitate the enemy without direct confrontation. This unconventional tactic was risky. Any miscalculation could endanger the Greek soldiers themselves, and the mental strain of deliberately exposing others to the same hazard that had devastated their own ranks weighed heavily on the men. Yet necessity dictated innovation, and some took the gamble, blending ingenuity with desperation in a grim reflection of the battlefield's brutal reality. The experiences of individual soldiers added further complexity to the story. A young mercenary from a distant Greek city, unfamiliar with the specific properties of the Himera River, approached the water to drink, ignoring the warnings of local soldiers. Within moments, he staggered and fell, shaking violently as his muscles failed. Comrades rushed to assist him, dragging him from the poisoned edge and attempting to keep him upright. This incident was mirrored countless times across the battlefield. Men whose lack of knowledge or simple misjudgment resulted in immediate consequences, reminding all that survival depended not just on courage or training, but also on environmental awareness, situational adaptation, and a constant vigilance that few could maintain for long. Meanwhile, Carthaginian engineers and support personnel, usually removed from the front line, began to observe patterns in the Greeks' interactions with the river. They noticed that certain water sources were avoided, while others were approached out of necessity. In some cases, they experimented with using the river strategically, throwing small quantities of toxic water toward enemy positions or guiding skirmishers into areas where contamination might incapacitate them. The battle, which had initially been a conventional engagement, was slowly evolving into a multi-dimensional struggle where environmental hazards, human vulnerability, and tactical ingenuity intersected in unexpected ways. The Greek commanders, recognizing the unprecedented challenges, attempted to implement contingency measures. Some ordered small detachments to carry water from safer sources, rationing it carefully to support critical units. Others reinforced defensive positions to prevent enemy forces from exploiting faltering lines, using terrain features such as low ridges, embankments, and small wooded areas for both cover and strategic advantage. These efforts were constrained by limited resources, the exhaustion of soldiers, and the unpredictable progression of the poisoned water's effects, yet they represented the best adaptation possible under dire circumstances. The narrative of suffering and ingenuity extended beyond soldiers to the animals that accompanied them. Horses, oxen, and pack animals used for logistics began to falter under the same conditions. Those that drank from contaminated sections of the river exhibited strange behavior. Some trembled, others refused to move, and a few collapsed outright, creating additional logistical and tactical complications. Soldiers were forced to improvise, dragging supplies or shifting the burdens of transport to surviving animals and men, further testing the endurance and ingenuity of everyone involved. In quieter moments, when the intensity of engagement ebbed slightly, soldiers became acutely aware of the physical and moral dimensions of their predicament. They bore witness to comrades incapacitated not by enemy attack, but by an invisible, almost capricious force. Conversations among small groups were tinged with fear, speculation, and frustration. Some attributed the river's effects to divine retribution, invoking the gods to explain a hazard so sudden and devastating. Others took a more pragmatic view, attempting to understand the natural causes and adjust behavior accordingly. The interplay of superstition, rational analysis, and sheer survival instinct created a psychological landscape as complex as the physical battlefield itself. The river's hidden poison also influenced medical and support practices on the battlefield. Field medics, who would normally focus on visible wounds, were forced to recognize and respond to symptoms of poisoning, weakness, trembling, nausea, often without clear understanding of the underlying cause. Improvised treatments, such as rinsing with clean water or applying compresses, offered limited relief, and many soldiers simply had to endure until the battle ended or they could be removed from the affected area. The presence of invisible toxins redefined the concept of medical care, illustrating how environmental hazards could compound human vulnerability in ways that direct combat could not. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian forces faced similar, though less severe, environmental stresses. Their knowledge of local rivers and water sources allowed them to avoid the most dangerous contamination, but heat, exertion, and dust still took a toll. Their commanders leveraged these relative advantages, pressing assaults on faltering Greek lines while maintaining reserves for critical interventions. Observing the interplay between human fatigue, environmental hazard, and tactical opportunity, they adapted dynamically, highlighting how battle is rarely dictated solely by strength of arms, but by perception, resource management, and the ability to exploit emerging conditions. As dusk approached, the battlefield was transformed yet again. Shadows lengthened across the plain, and the light illuminated the exhausted, soiled, and wounded soldiers with an almost surreal quality. Dust, sweat, and blood clung to armor and clothing, reflecting the cumulative toll of a day shaped as much by an invisible environmental hazard as by combat. The rhythm of battle slowed in some areas, punctuated by sudden flurries of engagement where exhausted men still found the strength to resist or attack. The interplay of light, shadow, fatigue, and poisoned water created a scene that was both chaotic and profoundly human, a testament to endurance, improvisation, and the unrelenting pressures of war. Small groups of soldiers huddled around safer water sources, attempting to regain strength and prepare for the night. They whispered warnings to each other, shared scant rations, and tended minor wounds, all while remaining acutely aware that the poison's effects might linger and that enemy patrols could strike even as darkness fell. Morale fluctuated, dependent on the success of small interventions and the persistence of hope, and commanders worked tirelessly to maintain cohesion, recognizing that the battle was not yet concluded and that the night might present new challenges equally formidable as the day. Even as night approached, the river continued to influence events. Soldiers who slept too close to its banks risked exposure to residual toxins or inadvertent immersion, while others drew small lines in the sand or created makeshift barriers to avoid its effects. The interplay between human ingenuity and environmental hazard persisted, demonstrating how the consequences of earlier choices, where to drink, how to move, which ground to hold, could echo across hours and shape not only immediate survival, but also the strategic landscape of the conflict. Tehe night brought a strange stillness to the battlefield, but it was a deceptive calm. The poisoned river had sapped the strength of many, and those who survived the day's ordeal found themselves wrestling not only with exhaustion, but with lingering symptoms of the toxins: dizziness, trembling limbs, and an almost imperceptible sluggishness that affected even their reflexes and awareness. The Carthaginian forces, although also tired, recognized an opportunity. The Greeks were weakened, and the cover of darkness could amplify their advantage. Scouts moved cautiously along the flanks, mapping positions, listening for signs of movement, and planning attacks that relied on precision rather than brute force. In the gloom, every sound, the snapping of a branch, the murmur of conversation, the distant call of an animal, could be interpreted as threat or opportunity. Meanwhile, small groups of Greek soldiers attempted to fortify temporary positions near safer sections of the river. Using fallen branches, loose stones, and whatever debris they could scavenge from the battlefield, they built rudimentary barricades to protect themselves from surprise attacks. The poisoned water had transformed from an immediate threat to a tactical consideration. Soldiers now calculated their proximity to it carefully, knowing that even minor contact could exacerbate their already weakened condition. Yet necessity forced them to remain near the river, as alternative sources were scarce or difficult to access. Each decision to drink, approach, or avoid carried immediate and potentially fatal consequences. In the shadows, individual acts of courage and ingenuity became more pronounced. One soldier, whose legs trembled violently from the poison, crawled toward a fallen comrade, dragging him away from a muddy patch near the riverbank. Every inch of progress was laborious, each movement drawing sweat from his brow and pain from his muscles, yet he persisted. Others created signals to warn approaching soldiers of contaminated water, using sticks or rocks to mark dangerous sections. These improvised systems, born from necessity, highlight the resourcefulness of men in crisis, even when the physical limits of endurance were being relentlessly tested. Above the chaos, the night sky gradually darkened, stars piercing the fading light, yet they offered little comfort to those below. The temperature dropped slightly, causing subtle shivers that compounded the effects of fatigue and poisoning. Soldiers huddled together in small clusters, whispering strategies, recounting moments from the day, or simply seeking the reassurance of human contact. The poisoned water had created not only a physical hazard but a psychological one. Men were constantly aware that the smallest lapse could bring collapse, and the threat was omnipresent, invisible, and unrelenting. Elsewhere, the Carthaginians began employing psychological tactics. They sent small, stealthy units along the riverbank to exploit gaps created by poisoned and weakened Greek soldiers. These units avoided direct confrontation when possible, instead focusing on intimidation, small raids, and harassment. The Greek soldiers, already on edge, were forced to divide attention between maintaining defensive positions and monitoring the river's edge, where the water's hidden threat compounded the danger of enemy actions. The interplay of environmental hazard and combat created a layered complexity in which every choice carried weighty consequences. Back at the Greek command center, Agathocles and his officers worked tirelessly to coordinate movements for the night. Lanterns illuminated maps scrawled with ink and chalk, showing troop positions, terrain features, and sections of the river deemed dangerous. Orders were written, messengers dispatched, and contingency plans formulated, all under the constant pressure of dwindling manpower and the unpredictable effects of the poisoned water. Communication became a critical tool, with even minor errors potentially leading to collapse or chaos. Commanders balanced the need for strategic foresight with the limitations imposed by human weakness, a task that required both intelligence and empathy. In the far reaches of the battlefield, the less experienced soldiers experienced a unique and haunting form of terror. The poisoned water, combined with exhaustion, created hallucinations for some. The river seemed to shift and writhe under the moonlight. Shadows of fallen comrades appeared to move, and distant sounds were interpreted as phantom attacks. These mental effects, though temporary, had real consequences. Soldiers froze, hesitated, or acted unpredictably, further complicating the delicate balance of survival and strategy. Veteran soldiers worked to calm them, offering guidance, support, and physical reassurance, highlighting the human dimension of leadership in conditions where nature and war conspired to erode perception and resolve. As the night deepened, supply lines and support efforts became a new arena of struggle. Small groups attempted to bring food, water, and medical supplies to weakened soldiers, navigating dangerous terrain and the poisoned river. Some carried water from distant, safer sources, rationing it carefully to avoid both thirst and overexposure. Others treated minor injuries with makeshift remedies, often improvising with strips of cloth, mud, and herbs found nearby. The combination of poison, fatigue, and environmental hazards turned even basic logistical tasks into monumental challenges, demanding creativity, determination, and extraordinary endurance from all involved. Throughout the night, isolated skirmishes continued. Bands of Greek soldiers, operating under the cover of darkness, attempted to secure strategic positions near the river while avoiding contaminated sections. They encountered Carthaginian patrols, resulting in brief, intense clashes that required careful coordination and rapid adaptation. The poisoned water remained a constant factor, influencing movement, positioning, and risk assessment. Even the smallest misstep, slipping on a muddy bank, brushing against contaminated water, or misjudging distance in the darkness, could have fatal consequences. Each action was magnified, each decision fraught with peril, and yet the soldiers persisted, driven by necessity, loyalty, and survival instinct. In one notable episode, a group of Greek soldiers discovered a natural rise along the riverbank, a small hillock that allowed observation of both the river and sections of the battlefield. They established a temporary lookout, scanning the surroundings for enemy movement and signs of further contamination. The elevated position offered a slight advantage, yet also presented danger, exposure to enemy observation and potential artillery or missile fire. Soldiers rotated shifts to maintain vigilance while conserving energy, demonstrating an intricate understanding of endurance management in extreme conditions. The poisoned water, present just meters away, added a constant threat, reminding them that survival required attention not only to combat but to every environmental factor. As dawn approached, the first hints of light revealed the extent of the previous day's toll. Bodies littered the battlefield, some victims of direct combat, others of the poisoned water. Soldiers moved more cautiously, aware of the lingering effects of toxin, heat, and exhaustion. Commanders conducted rapid assessments, redistributing forces and fortifying positions in preparation for the continuation of conflict. Even minor terrain features, small rises, depressions, and rocky patches, were evaluated for safety relative to the poisoned river, highlighting how a single environmental element could shape both tactical and human decisions on a large scale. The interplay between human endurance, environmental hazard, and strategy continued to define the narrative. Soldiers who had survived the initial onslaught adapted, developing new methods to minimize exposure, conserve energy, and maintain cohesion. Those responsible for logistics experimented with alternative routes, timing movements to avoid contaminated areas, and rationing supplies to maximize utility. The poisoned water had become not only a hazard but a defining factor in every decision, forcing innovation, resilience, and an acute awareness of risk at all levels. The morning light revealed the full scale of the battlefield's transformation. The river, previously a source of life, now appeared almost sinister in its calm, its waters glinting under the early sun with a deceptive serenity. Soldiers who had survived the night's struggle emerged from makeshift shelters and shallow dugouts, their bodies stiff from exhaustion, their movements cautious as they recalibrated to the reality of the day. The poisoned water had left an indelible mark on the ranks. Some men still trembled, others moved with a slow, deliberate caution, and a few, in rare instances, collapsed outright from lingering effects. Commanders took note immediately, recognizing that the day would be defined as much by careful management of human frailty as by battlefield maneuvers. The riverbanks, lined with mud, debris, and the remnants of the previous day's chaos, were hazardous not only for drinking but for movement. Soldiers discovered that even stepping too close could result in sudden slips or immersion in shallow, toxic pools. Units were forced to adapt their movements, shifting from traditional formations to staggered, cautious lines that prioritized safety over tight coordination. These adjustments, while reducing the effectiveness of some maneuvers, became a necessity, as the poisoned water had effectively redefined the operational terrain. Scouts reported to Agathocles with a grim realization. Small tributaries flowing into the river had variable levels of contamination. Some were relatively safe, though difficult to access, while others were deadly even to minimal contact. Decisions had to be made rapidly. Should men risk long detours to find safe water, slowing their advance and potentially exposing themselves to enemy observation? Or should they ration what remained, accepting the gradual weakening effects of minor contamination. Every choice carried enormous consequences, and the commander's ability to balance risk, necessity, and the unpredictable human response became the central determinant of survival. Meanwhile, the Carthaginians, aware that the Greek army had been affected by the poisoned water, began a calculated campaign to exploit it further. Rather than launching a full frontal assault immediately, they deployed small, highly mobile units to harass weakened sections. They observed the Greek formations carefully, noting how troops avoided certain river sections, how individuals staggered or stumbled, and how fatigue influenced defensive positioning. These observations allowed the Carthaginians to plan strikes that would maximize pressure while minimizing unnecessary risk. The poisoned water had, in effect, become a force multiplier for those with situational awareness, amplifying the impact of relatively small units. Within the Greek lines, adaptation and improvisation were essential. Soldiers devised ways to filter water or reduce exposure, using cloth or leather to strain particulates, collecting rainwater where possible, and sharing what little clean water they had among the most critical positions. Leaders prioritized which units received the limited resources, creating a hierarchy of necessity that was harsh but vital. Soldiers themselves learned to recognize early signs of poisoning, muscle tremors, dizziness, pallor, and adjusted activity levels accordingly, conserving strength when possible while still maintaining essential defense. The integration of survival tactics into daily combat strategy reflected a new dimension of warfare, one in which natural hazards could dictate terms as severely as the enemy's weapons. In one dramatic episode, a small detachment tasked with defending a critical river crossing discovered that a section of the bank had become unusually slick due to a combination of mud, spilled water, and residual toxin. As the Carthaginians advanced, several Greek soldiers lost footing, sliding perilously close to the poisoned water. Comrades rushed to pull them back, forming human chains to stabilize movement and prevent collapse. The scene was one of desperate coordination, in which physical strength, trust, and split-second improvisation combined to prevent disaster. It illustrated a harsh reality. Even small miscalculations or a single misstep could prove fatal, and the battlefield's hazards were now inseparably intertwined with human action. Psychological tension intensified as the day progressed. Soldiers became acutely aware that the poisoned water was an invisible enemy, striking unpredictably and without prejudice. Even the most experienced men, hardened by previous campaigns, expressed caution or hesitation when approaching the river or engaging in strenuous activity near it. Commanders attempted to maintain morale by emphasizing tactical victories, small achievements, and the importance of discipline, yet the underlying anxiety persisted. Each man's confidence was tested not only by the enemy, but by the unpredictability of his own body's reaction to environmental exposure. The interplay between terrain and strategy became increasingly complex. Elevated ridges overlooking the river offered advantageous observation points, but even these were dangerous. Men who fell or stumbled could plummet into contaminated water, suffering immediate consequences. Low-lying areas near the river provided some cover, but often trapped soldiers in muddy, unstable ground. Engineers and scouts attempted to mark safe zones, construct makeshift paths, and guide units along the least hazardous routes. But the poison had effectively transformed the river and surrounding terrain into a constantly shifting strategic variable. Meanwhile, the Carthaginians began experimenting with further environmental tactics. They diverted small sections of tributary flow toward areas where Greek units had been gathering, creating miniature streams that forced soldiers to choose between dehydration and exposure to the toxin. These subtle manipulations required precise timing and coordination, reflecting an advanced understanding of the battlefield's dynamics. The Greeks, in turn, were forced to observe and adapt, learning to read the environment as a co-participant in warfare rather than merely a backdrop. In one isolated but intense encounter, a Greek unit attempting to flank a Carthaginian detachment misjudged a patch of contaminated mud. Soldiers sank knee-deep, weapons slipping from weakened grips, and were momentarily paralyzed in place. Carthaginians seized the opportunity, pressing their attack on the immobilized men. Yet the Greeks, using a combination of makeshift grappling with ropes and shields to stabilize movement, managed to extricate themselves and counterattack. This engagement, though small in scale, exemplified the adaptive strategies that arose specifically because of the poisoned river. Improvisation, observation, and creative problem-solving became as important as combat skill. As the sun reached its zenith, exhaustion had reached new levels. The subtle effects of the poison were compounded by hunger, heat, and the relentless demand for activity. Soldiers who had seemed capable earlier in the morning now faltered, some collapsing without warning, others moving with deliberate, agonizing slowness. The psychological effects were as pronounced as the physical: fear of the river, frustration at lost strength, and anxiety over the unpredictable reactions of comrades created a pervasive tension that influenced every decision. Leaders balanced empathy with necessity, guiding men through both moral and practical challenges in a landscape where both human and environmental factors threatened survival. Logistical challenges became central to the ongoing engagement. Supplies had to be moved carefully to avoid contaminated zones, while medical attention focused not only on wounds, but on symptoms of poisoning: trembling, nausea, pallor, and dizziness. Field medics and soldiers improvised with the limited resources available, using clean water, cloth compresses, and basic herbal remedies in attempts to mitigate the poison's effects. Even these efforts were only partially effective, emphasizing that in this battle, human skill and ingenuity were continuously tested against an invisible, insidious adversary. The poisoned river had reshaped the very nature of combat. Maneuvers that would have been straightforward in a conventional engagement now carried unpredictable consequences. Soldiers learned to move cautiously, scouts operated with heightened awareness, and leaders integrated environmental observation into every strategic decision. What had begun as a conventional battle evolved into a multidimensional struggle, a contest of skill, courage, endurance, ingenuity, and survival under the relentless influence of an unseen yet potent natural hazard. The river, now fully recognized as a central force in the battle, dictated much of the movement and decision-making across the plain. Even soldiers stationed far from its banks were acutely aware of its invisible threat, for reports of collapsing comrades traveled quickly, whispered warnings echoing through ranks like a shadow of fear. Those who had been fortunate enough to avoid direct contact watched their neighbors struggle, the knowledge that one wrong step could result in sudden incapacitation haunting every decision. In this environment, the distinction between frontline combat and environmental hazard blurred. The river itself had become an active participant in the conflict, shaping outcomes in ways that swords, spears, and shields could not. At strategic points along the plain, Greek and Carthaginian forces engaged in a delicate dance, balancing aggression with caution. Greek commanders directed their weakened units to occupy slightly higher ground near the river, using small hills and ridges to both observe the enemy and reduce direct contact with contaminated water. Troops moved slowly, adjusting stance with each step to maintain balance, leaning on shields or teammates for stability. Soldiers were forced to ration their physical strength carefully. Every exertion, raising a spear, climbing a ridge, or dragging a comrade, required conscious assessment of energy expenditure against necessity. One miscalculation could render them useless in a critical moment, leaving a position vulnerable to enemy exploitation. Meanwhile, Carthaginian commanders realized that traditional battlefield tactics had to be modified in response to the unusual conditions. Units were ordered to test Greek lines in small increments, probing for weaknesses without overcommitting. Ambushes were planned along areas where the river's influence was strongest, relying on the probability that the Greeks' compromised stamina would create exploitable gaps. Scouts and light infantry moved stealthily through contaminated zones, relying on local knowledge and careful observation to avoid the worst of the poison. This blend of environmental manipulation, tactical acumen, and psychological pressure exemplified a sophisticated understanding of the battlefield's evolving dynamics. Soldiers, both Greek and Carthaginian, were now fighting a battle of anticipation as much as execution. Every movement required the constant calculation of risk. How close could one approach the river without endangering themselves? Could one hold a position while physically impaired, knowing that the enemy might exploit fatigue or slowed reflexes? Small mistakes, slipping on a muddy bank, misjudging footing near the water, overexerting themselves in combat, were magnified under the conditions, sometimes resulting in immediate collapse or exposure to enemy fire. The battlefield had become a complex network of tactical, environmental, and physiological hazards that constantly demanded attention and adaptation. In one particularly tense scene, a contingent of Greek soldiers attempted to cross a shallow tributary to flank an approaching Carthaginian unit. The water, deceptively calm, had pockets of concentrated poison and mud, and several soldiers were quickly immobilized when their legs sank deep into sticky, contaminated sediment. Comrades scrambled to assist, creating human chains and using shields and ropes to stabilize movement. The Carthaginians, observing from a nearby ridge, pressed their advantage with archers and slingers, exploiting the temporary immobility of the Greeks. Yet the soldiers, relying on improvisation, grit, and quick thinking, managed to extract themselves and regroup, turning a near disaster into a hard-won maneuver that momentarily disrupted the enemy's plan. Simultaneously, the psychological strain on the soldiers reached new heights. The poisoned river, having removed the security of predictability, forced men to remain in a state of near-constant vigilance. The fear of unseen effects, combined with exhaustion and pain, created a unique form of battlefield stress. Some soldiers became hesitant, second-guessing their actions, while others exhibited moments of surprising clarity and focus, perhaps driven by adrenaline or sheer determination. Leaders had to manage both the physical and mental dimensions of this stress, issuing commands that accounted for the visible and invisible pressures upon their troops. Field medics and auxiliary personnel faced unprecedented challenges. Many had to navigate hazardous terrain, avoiding contaminated water while tending to soldiers who displayed both visible injuries and the subtle, insidious symptoms of poisoning. Treatments were improvised. Clean water applied externally, cloth compresses soaked to dilute the toxin on contact areas, and encouragement to move carefully while maintaining morale. Yet despite all efforts, the poisoned river had a lasting, pervasive impact, underscoring that environmental hazards could rival, and sometimes surpass, the effects of enemy action in shaping battlefield outcomes. Even non-combatants on the battlefield were drawn into the struggle. Porters, supply carriers, and camp followers moved cautiously, aware that contact with the poisoned river could render them incapacitated. Horses, pack animals, and livestock faced similar risks, some refusing to move near contaminated zones, others faltering or collapsing after contact. Soldiers adapted by redirecting animal traffic, rationing clean water, and creating temporary barriers to shield vital resources. The poisoned river had expanded the theater of hazard, making logistical management an active and continuous challenge. Throughout the day, leaders on both sides observed the subtle effects of cumulative poisoning. Soldiers, reflexes slowed, coordination faltered, and even trained maneuvers required more time and attention to execute. The Carthaginians, recognizing patterns of vulnerability, intensified targeted attacks against units showing early signs of collapse. Greek commanders, aware of the enemy's observation, reorganized units to maximize stability, placing stronger soldiers alongside weakened men, and sometimes temporarily withdrawing entire sections to reduce exposure. These decisions required rapid judgment under pressure, blending battlefield experience with the constant monitoring of environmental influence. In one of the more dramatic sequences, a Greek unit tasked with defending a narrow bridge over a side tributary found that its footing had been partially compromised by the poisoned water. Soldiers who had crossed the bridge earlier in the day had left mud and contamination, turning the surface slick and treacherous. Carthaginian forces pressed forward, intending to seize the bridge, but the Greeks, improvising with ropes, shields, and careful coordination, managed to hold the position. The skirmish highlighted how even small environmental details, the mud on a bridge, the subtle toxicity of river water, could dictate the outcome of key tactical points and shift momentum in ways that conventional combat alone could not. By mid-afternoon, the battlefield resembled a landscape of survival and improvisation more than traditional engagement. Soldiers adjusted their formations, moved cautiously, and relied heavily on observation of both terrain and enemy behavior. The poisoned river had reshaped priorities, conserving strength, avoiding exposure, and maintaining situational awareness had become as vital as offensive action. Leadership, communication, and quick adaptation emerged as decisive factors, with soldiers, endurance, creativity, and attention to the environment determining the battle's progress as much as any skill with weapons. The late afternoon brought with it a subtle shift in the battlefield's rhythm. The sun, dipping lower in the Sicilian sky, cast elongated shadows across the plain, exaggerating every ripple in the river, every uneven patch of mud, and every figure struggling with fatigue. Soldiers who had managed to endure the morning and midday exertion now faced compounded challenges. Muscles already weakened by the poisoned water strained further, coordination faltered, and small injuries, bruises, cuts, or twisted ankles, took on an outsized significance. Commanders recognized that the day's final hours might be decisive, yet the poisoned river had altered the conventional calculus. Speed, maneuvering, and aggression were no longer simple virtues. Survival required calculated restraint and judicious energy management. Near one of the wider bends of the Himera River, a contingent of Greek soldiers attempted to secure a defensive position that overlooked both the river and the advancing Carthaginian units. The ground was treacherous, partially flooded in areas, slick with mud, and lined with debris from fallen trees and previous engagements. Soldiers moved slowly, testing each step, using shields and spears to maintain balance while keeping a wary eye on the enemy. The poisoned water created a constant tension. Any accidental immersion or contact could rapidly incapacitate even the strongest men, forcing the group to coordinate every movement with precision and vigilance. In the midst of this, a small detachment of Greek skirmishers undertook a daring reconnaissance mission. Their task was to map safe passages along the riverbank and locate sections of uncontaminated water for essential supply. As they moved, they discovered that some tributaries contained only mild contamination, while shallow pools retained dangerous levels of poison, making each step a gamble. The skirmishers employed ingenuity and improvisation, using long branches to probe the depth and consistency of mud, marking hazards with small piles of stones, and signaling back to the main force with subtle gestures to avoid alerting Carthaginian observers. The poisoned river had transformed reconnaissance into a high-stakes operation, demanding both courage and meticulous attention to environmental detail. Meanwhile, Carthaginian commanders observed these Greek movements with keen interest. They recognized the interplay between human vulnerability and the environment, understanding that the poisoned river was now a strategic tool as much as a natural obstacle. Small units were sent to pressure the Greeks along the river, using missile fire and tactical probes to exploit moments when soldiers falter. In some cases, minor disturbances, rock thrown to create a splash, sudden noise along the banks, caused Greek soldiers to misjudge footing or exposure, further amplifying the river's insidious influence. The Carthaginians had effectively integrated environmental manipulation into traditional military tactics, using observation, subtle harassment, and timing to maximize advantage. Within Greek ranks, improvisation became increasingly sophisticated. Soldiers devised methods to reduce exposure to contaminated water while maintaining operational effectiveness. Some used cloth wrappings on boots to prevent direct contact with mud, while others created temporary walkways from logs or planks to navigate treacherous sections. Small units were reorganized to pair stronger, less affected men with those displaying early signs of weakness, ensuring that critical positions could still be defended. The poisoned water dictated these adaptations, shaping the very structure of command and unit deployment. In one particularly tense episode, a group of Greek soldiers had to cross a narrow causeway near the river under the threat of Carthaginian archers. The surface was slick with a combination of mud and residual poison, and several men slipped as they attempted to advance. Leaders quickly organized a human chain, using shields and ropes to stabilize each soldier's movement while simultaneously returning fire to keep the enemy at bay. The combination of physical support, tactical coordination, and improvisation allowed the unit to traverse the hazard successfully, demonstrating how adaptability and human ingenuity could overcome even extreme environmental adversity. The psychological dimension of the battle became increasingly pronounced. Soldiers were forced to balance fear, determination, and the relentless pressure of decision-making. Each approach to the river or contaminated zone demanded careful calculation. A misstep could result in sudden incapacitation, while hesitation could allow the enemy to exploit a temporary advantage. Commanders worked tirelessly to maintain morale, emphasizing small victories and the importance of coordination, while soldiers themselves developed acute awareness of their own physical and mental limits. The poisoned river had shifted the battlefield from a contest of brute strength to a nuanced struggle of endurance, observation, and psychological resilience. Field medics faced their own escalating challenges. With casualties mounting from both combat and the effects of the poisoned water, they had to prioritize interventions carefully. Some soldiers displayed severe muscle weakness and tremors, while others showed signs of disorientation or fainting. Medics improvised with minimal supplies, applying compresses, washing contaminated areas with scarce clean water, and administering basic herbal remedies. Even these efforts were only partially effective, highlighting the pervasive, insidious nature of the river's influence. Medical response, logistics, and battlefield management were now intertwined in a complex web of survival, with the poison serving as a relentless variable. Even non-combatants, such as supply carriers and livestock, were forced to navigate the river's hazards. Pack animals balked at contaminated water or slipped in mud, requiring soldiers to redirect their loads manually. Porters carrying rations, weapons, or water had to find safe passages while under threat of enemy attack. The poisoned river had expanded its influence beyond direct human combat, affecting every aspect of the battlefield's functioning, and underscoring the interplay between environmental hazard and the logistical realities of sustaining an army in prolonged engagement. As evening approached, the battle's rhythm slowed under the weight of exhaustion, injury, and continued exposure to poisoned water. Soldiers moved with deliberate caution, carefully calculating each step, while commanders coordinated positions to protect weakened units and preserve critical resources. The river, though silent, continued to assert its presence, influencing every maneuver, decision, and strategy. The battlefield had become a theater in which human resilience, tactical ingenuity, and environmental hazard were inextricably linked, shaping the unfolding conflict in ways that no conventional analysis could fully predict. As night fell, a new layer of complexity settled over the battlefield. Darkness added both cover and peril, transforming familiar terrain into a landscape of uncertainty. Soldiers could no longer rely on visual cues to navigate the poisoned river or identify safe patches of ground, and the simplest movements, crossing a muddy bank, approaching a tributary, or advancing along a ridge, became exercises in extreme caution. Lanterns and torches, though sparingly used to conserve resources and avoid detection, cast flickering shadows that distorted depth perception, sometimes making safe areas appear hazardous and vice versa. The poisoned river had transformed from a daytime hazard into an omnipresent threat, now entwined with the disorienting effects of night. In these conditions, the battlefield became a stage for stealth and cunning. Small units of Carthaginian soldiers began nighttime infiltration, moving silently along the riverbank to probe weakened Greek positions. Their movements were calculated to exploit both the poisoned water and the cover of darkness. In several instances, Greek soldiers who had cautiously avoided the most toxic sections were lured into contaminated areas by feigned retreats or subtle manipulations of light and sound. The river's invisible threat amplified the impact of these maneuvers. One slip could not only expose a soldier to enemy attack, but also trigger sudden incapacitation, further destabilizing lines. Amidst this, the Greek forces experimented with inventive defensive measures. Makeshift barriers of wood and brush were erected along critical river crossings, both to protect against direct assault and to deter accidental entry into contaminated water. Fires were carefully positioned to provide illumination without attracting unnecessary attention, and scouts patrolled the edges of these safe zones, signaling to units when enemy movements approached. Soldiers adapted their weapons and formations. Shorter thrusts, lowered stances, and careful spacing minimized exertion while maintaining combat readiness. The poisoned river had forced the Greeks to rethink conventional tactics entirely, integrating environmental hazard management into every aspect of their strategy. In one harrowing episode, a Greek officer noticed a group of soldiers beginning to display severe symptoms of poisoning, trembling limbs, nausea, and disorientation. Realizing that exposure could quickly incapacitate more men, he organized a rapid extraction, instructing soldiers to form human chains to pull the affected men towards safer ground. The process was painstaking and dangerous. Any misstep could send multiple men slipping into the contaminated river or into enemy lines. Yet the operation succeeded, illustrating the critical importance of improvisation, leadership, and teamwork under conditions that traditional military training could scarcely prepare anyone for. Meanwhile, psychological factors intensified under the cover of darkness. Fear of the poisoned river, combined with fatigue and the unknown positions of the enemy, created heightened tension. Soldiers reported seeing phantasms in the shadows or hearing noises that did not exist. Some experienced vivid hallucinations of river spirits or divine punishment, interpreting the poison as a supernatural force rather than a chemical hazard. Leaders, aware of the psychological toll, sought to maintain cohesion through quiet encouragement, organized rotations, and the reinforcement of trust between soldiers. Morale became as vital a consideration as physical strength, for even the most capable troops could falter under relentless mental strain. Logistics in the night presented another layer of difficulty. Supplies of food, clean water, and medical materials had to be moved carefully along paths that minimized exposure to the poisoned river. Messengers risked their lives navigating unfamiliar terrain in near darkness, balancing the urgency of communication with the constant threat of contamination and enemy ambush. Horses and pack animals, sensitive to terrain and danger, frequently balked or became immobilized in muddy sections, forcing soldiers to improvise and redistribute loads manually. The poisoned river had transformed logistical operations into a high-stakes challenge, where precision, patience, and careful observation were as critical as physical endurance. In a separate area, a Carthaginian commander identified a weak Greek flank where the poisoned river had forced troops into precarious positions. He dispatched a small unit to harass and pressure the exposed men, timing their approach to coincide with peak weakness. The soldiers, already fatigued and partially poisoned, struggled to respond. Minor mistakes, a dropped shield, delayed thrust, or slip on mud, were magnified under the circumstances. Yet the Greeks adapted, using terrain, careful coordination, and improvised tools such as ropes and branches to stabilize their positions and resist collapse. The poisoned river had created a dynamic where environmental mastery, rather than sheer strength or numbers, dictated the ebb and flow of engagement. During this night, interactions with the river revealed subtler, more insidious consequences. Some soldiers who had avoided drinking its waters suffered from indirect exposure. Splashes of mud, damp clothing, and proximity to contaminated sections produced delayed symptoms. The poison's effect was no longer confined to direct ingestion. The battlefield had become a web of potential hazard, where every movement and touch could carry risk. This forced soldiers to adopt behaviors reminiscent of survivalists: careful observation, cautious movement, and constant evaluation of risk. Traditional formations gave way to dispersed, adaptive tactics, emphasizing safety, awareness, and the preservation of human strength. Field medics faced compounded challenges during the night. With diminished light, limited resources, and the ongoing need to treat both conventional injuries and poison-related symptoms, they had to prioritize triage meticulously. Those most incapacitated by the river's toxins were stabilized first, with makeshift stretchers, ropes, and human chains used to move them to safer zones. Even minor treatments, such as cleansing contaminated skin or rehydrating soldiers with small amounts of clean water, became critical interventions. The poisoned river had effectively expanded the concept of battlefield medicine, forcing practitioners to integrate environmental awareness with tactical support under extreme conditions. By midnight, the battlefield had taken on an almost surreal quality. Fires and lanterns flickered in the distance, highlighting soldiers moving cautiously across muddy banks. Shadows danced across the poisoned river, its deceptively calm surface concealing danger beneath. The sounds of distant skirmishes, coupled with the groans of the poisoned and injured, created a tense symphony of fear, strategy, and survival. Every individual's actions, whether crossing a shallow tributary, dragging a fallen comrade, or signaling an approaching enemy, were influenced not only by combat skill, but by an acute awareness of the invisible hazard that had reshaped the engagement entirely. The final hours of the Battle of the Himera River unfolded with a tense, almost unbearable intensity, a crescendo in which human endurance, environmental hazard, and strategic decision-making converged in ways that would define the fate of all involved. The poisoned river, calm and unassuming in its appearance, had exerted a silent dominion over the battlefield, dictating movement, shaping tactical choices, and exacting a toll that was subtle yet profound. Soldiers, already drained by hours of combat, by fatigue, by hunger, and by the relentless strain of vigilance, faced the cruel paradox of survival. The very waters that could quench their thirst could also accelerate their demise. By the late afternoon and early evening, the Greek ranks were in a state of extreme depletion. Even veteran soldiers, accustomed to harsh campaigns and long marches, felt the creeping weight of the poison. Muscles trembled involuntarily, reflexes slowed, coordination faltered, and the mind wavered between sharp focus and moments of dizzy confusion. Commanders, acutely aware that their men were on the brink, faced impossible choices: ration remaining clean water, attempt to find alternative sources, or risk the perils of the poisoned river itself. The decision was not abstract. Every soldier's strength and consciousness depended on hydration, yet every sip of water drawn from the Himera River carried the latent threat of further debilitation or death. It was within this crucible of necessity that the crucial decision occurred. Greek soldiers drank from the poisoned water. Why did they do so? There was no simple answer. It was neither ignorance nor fatalism, though elements of both played a role. The river, flowing through the center of the battlefield, was the most immediate source of hydration available. Alternative sources, such as distant wells or tributaries, required dangerous detours across exposed ground, often under enemy observation and fire. The Greek soldiers, already weakened and on the verge of collapse, were confronted with an immediate biological imperative: survival in the face of dehydration. For some, drinking from the river was a calculated gamble, a desperate choice in which the certainty of thirst and exhaustion outweighed the uncertain, delayed consequences of the poison. For others, it was a failure of recognition, a misjudgment born of cognitive fatigue. The mind, fogged by the relentless strain of battle and the insidious effects of partial poisoning, failed to fully register the invisible hazard in front of them. As soldiers drank, the effects manifested in waves. Some felt sudden weakness in the limbs, tremors in hands gripping shields, and a wobbly step that threatened collapse. Others experienced nausea, dizziness, or disorientation, reducing their ability to respond effectively in combat. Yet paradoxically, the act of drinking allowed immediate survival, granting enough strength to continue maneuvering, fighting, or retreating. It was a delicate balance between short-term necessity and long-term hazard, a vivid illustration of how human decision-making operates under extreme physiological and psychological stress. Drinking poisoned water became, in essence, an act of desperate pragmatism. Men gambled with their vitality to maintain immediate operational capacity, fully aware, or at least partially aware, of the potential consequences. The Carthaginians, ever observant, noticed this pattern. They understood that the Greeks' vulnerability was both physical and moral. By creating pressure points near sections of the river, or subtly manipulating the terrain to funnel soldiers toward contaminated areas, they exploited a situation in which human necessity and environmental hazard intersected. Greek soldiers were forced into making real-time risk assessments under duress, advancing to hold a critical position, providing aid to a fallen comrade, or merely crossing the river to avoid ambush. Each action required a calculation in which the river's poison was an omnipresent variable. In this way, the Himera River became not only a hazard but a strategic instrument, shaping the course of the battle in concert with the choices of commanders and the endurance of individual soldiers. The psychological dimension of the decision to drink poisoned water cannot be overstated. Fatigue, stress, and constant exposure to threat distorted perception. Soldiers witnessed friends collapse after taking a single sip, yet continued to drink because the alternative, dehydration and imminent collapse, was immediate and undeniable. Panic was tempered by discipline, but fear coexisted with necessity, producing a state of heightened awareness in which every choice was weighed against survival instinct. Leadership was critical. Commanders who could maintain calm, issue clear instructions, and reassure their troops often saw units endure longer, navigate hazards more effectively, and retain cohesion under the twin pressures of combat and environmental poisoning. Those who faltered in guidance often precipitated collapse, illustrating the interdependence of morale, decision-making, and environmental conditions. Simultaneously, soldiers adapted to the poisoned river in subtle, ingenious ways. Cloths were used to strain water, mud was scraped from boots before crossing shallow streams, and makeshift markers were erected to indicate hazardous zones. Leaders rotated soldiers frequently, allowing brief periods of rest and recovery, while small groups coordinated movements to minimize exposure to contaminated water. These adaptations were not perfect. Failures still occurred with tragic frequency. Yet they reflected the resilience and ingenuity of human beings confronted with a threat that was invisible, pervasive, and deadly. The poisoned river had become a teacher of survival, compelling soldiers to innovate and improvise in real time. As the battle wore on, the cumulative effect of poisoned water, fatigue, injury, and psychological strain reshaped the engagement. Traditional formations gave way to dispersed, flexible units. Soldiers moved cautiously, relying on observation, intuition, and support from comrades to navigate both natural and human hazards. Every footstep became a micro-decision, every choice of position a balancing act between immediate utility and latent risk. Those who survived did so not merely through courage or combat skill, but through continuous assessment, adaptation, and an acute awareness of the environment. The poisoned river, silent yet potent, had dictated both action and outcome. By the final hours of combat, a pattern emerged that clarified why the soldiers drank the poisoned water. It was a convergence of human biology, battlefield necessity, and tactical reality. Thirst was not abstract. It was immediate, gnawing, and physically debilitating. Hydration could restore enough strength to lift a shield, thrust a spear, or maintain position. The poison was insidious, delayed in effect, and often unevenly distributed, meaning that drinking occasionally allowed temporary recovery even as long-term risk persisted. Greek soldiers, faced with the choice between certain collapse from dehydration or calculated exposure to poison, overwhelmingly chose survival. It was an agonizing, conscious calculus, an intersection of necessity, risk, and courage that illuminates the human condition in extremis. As the battle drew to its conclusion, the full scale of the river's influence became evident. Entire units were weakened or incapacitated not by enemy swords, but by their interaction with the poisoned water. Strategic victories and losses were inseparable from the river's subtle but relentless toll. Leadership, coordination, and individual ingenuity determined whether soldiers survived exposure or fell victim to the hidden hazard. The poisoned Himera River had transformed a conventional battle into an ordeal of endurance, perception, and decision-making under extreme duress. In summary, the soldiers drank poisoned water during the Battle of the Himera River primarily because the immediate need to survive outweighed the delayed risks of toxicity. They faced a stark choice: succumb to dehydration or risk exposure to poison. The river's poison became both a physical hazard and a strategic factor, shaping the course of combat, forcing adaptation, and highlighting the interplay between human necessity and environmental influence. Tactical decisions, improvisation, and resilience were as decisive as conventional arms. Leadership, observation, and ingenuity allowed men to survive, navigate, and sometimes exploit the river's presence, demonstrating that survival in war often hinges on the ability to negotiate invisible, unpredictable threats as effectively as direct ones. The battle stands as a testament to human endurance and adaptability. It illustrates how natural elements, poisoned water in this case, can decisively influence outcomes, how soldiers navigate impossible choices under extreme duress, and how leadership, ingenuity, and courage are tested in multidimensional ways. The narrative is one of suffering, innovation, and the relentless will to survive in circumstances where every decision carries life or death consequences. Thank you for watching this long exploration of the Battle of the Himera River. If you found this deep dive into history fascinating, make sure to subscribe for more long-form history videos. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story, and leave a comment sharing what part of the battle or strategy surprised you the most. Your support helps keep history alive, explored, and understood in detail.